The FBI has now executed a new search warrant at a Washington Post journalist's home in Virginia. The administration says this is part of an investigation into a government contractor that they accuse of illegally retaining classified materials. The Post reporting FBI agents have now seized this reporter's phone, 2 laptops, and a watch. One of the laptops was a personal computer, the other a Washington Post issued laptop. Investigators tell the Post reporter that she's not the focus of this probe, that the target is a government contractor, and according to the criminal complaint, is alleged to have had secret documents in a lunchbox and his own basement, which could be a violation of the rules. Attorney General Bondi alleges the Post reporter also published illegally leaked information. Of course, that is, when you cover the government, what happens all the time. It is also worth noting the complaint, which may be partial, may only be the start of the story, but the complaint itself does not accuse that contractor of leaking classified information. Now, this is obviously drawing intense scrutiny because while the government does have wide latitude in legitimate national security cases, and there have been times in the past where we've seen, as a last resort, reporters basically dealt with and investigated, or their materials investigated in security litigation, this comes amid a time where the Trump DOJ under Bondi has very little credibility, and the president has mused about going after all kinds of opponents and has done so. And he and his allies have viewed many in the press, as you know, as their sort of political opponents. Andrew Weissmann, of course, is a prosecutor. He was on the Mueller probe, and also remind people, as FBI general counsel, he would literally look at and enforce the rules for the people doing the enforcement of the law for the rest of us. Welcome, Andrew. I wanted to stay first big picture. Anyone who's followed any story or any case knows it takes time to get all the facts. And so the Washington Post action is definitely severe. We can report that it is severe and unusual. But whether it's ultimately part of a lawful probe that judges would bless from the beginning to the end, we don't really know. But the big picture I mentioned is that you have multiple lawmakers who are literally being threatened over their First Amendment rights, what they said about policy on a video, the Fed for its job. Big picture, what do you think of the legality of these crackdowns?
So big picture. So first, I do think with respect to the leak investigation, if you turn your attention away from the alleged leaker who has been charged, and the complaint looks like a sort of, the plain vanilla charge that you would see in a case like this. There, of course, is the irony that, of course, we have a president who was facing the exact same charges, but was alleged to have done far worse. Let's leave that aside. To me, the thing that we do know from the Washington Post is that the normal processes that would have been followed in other administrations were not followed here. It really seems like they just jumped to a search warrant. And that is a real attack on the so-called Fourth Estate. Did they try and get the documents just voluntarily? Did they issue a subpoena? Was there negotiation? What we're being told by the Washington Post is no. So I think big picture, we do know that this is a very different stance that the administration has with respect to people who are supposed to, as you do, Ari, cover the news and call out bogus statements by the government when when it's right, we're supposed to say it's right, and when it's wrong, we're supposed to call it out. So this is an attack on that, and I think what you're saying with respect to Senator Kelly, with respect to Senator Slotkin, what you saw with Letitia James, with James Comey, I think is a variation on that. You're seeing the sort of true weaponization of enemies, but at the same side, you're seeing a lack of investigation of Pete Hegseth when he uses Signal to talk about war plans. A lack of investigation of Tom Homan when he is alleged to have taken $50,000 of cash in a kava bag. A lack of investigation of the ICE agent who we know shot and killed an unarmed woman in Minnesota. But we are seeing, by the way, an investigation that's now been reported of her background and that of her widow. So you really are seeing the sort of true weaponization of the department by this administration.
Yeah, and the president reportedly just is unhappy that while the actions matter and the harassment matters, the cases so far have been thin enough that a year in, I would remind everyone, no one on that chart we showed has been convicted of anything. And Journal reports, Trump says they're not moving fast enough at DOJ to prosecute his targets, which that reporting would suggest a confession. At what point, other than getting these cases dismissed, Kelly seems to be going more on offense. At what point would there be more of a reckoning for people at the DOJ who knowingly abuse those powers without meeting the required legal standard for these cases?
Well, one of the things I would note is that the administration seems to be taking a step to avoid the Department of Justice altogether. They announced just a few days ago that they're going to have an alleged fraud prosecutor, but that assistant attorney general is not going to be within the Department of Justice. They're going to be housed and reporting directly to the White House and not reporting to Pam Bondi and Todd Blanche. So that is, complete eradication of a separation between the White House and the Department of Justice. And what can happen to people at the Department of Justice, at the leadership, if they're engaged in wrongdoing, sort of intentionally or in bad faith? The answer is right now, not a whole lot, although down the road, if it can be shown, there are consequences from losing their bar ticket or having bar complaints and sanctioning to things that are more serious. But the more serious is unlikely to happen because you do have to show intentionality if they were intentionally to commit a crime. And also at the federal level, the president can pardon people on his way out the door, assuming he leaves and goes out that door.
Washington Post reports on what we were discussing with the search of this Washington Post reporter's journalist home, that any search targeting journalists warrants intense scrutiny because these kinds of searches, according to First Amendment expert Jamil Jaffer, can deter and impede reporting. And when you look at what Bondi rescinded that I mentioned in April, this was what was telegraphed. Bondi basically canceled what had been a Biden policy preventing officials from searching reporters' records when trying to ID government personnel. Bondi said in a memo that the media shouldn't get those protections. And what you described was an interest in a show of force, that rather than saying, well, we want to get this material, so there's ways we can get it and subpoena it, and that's our priority. Here, there seems to be a willingness or even an interest in starting with what was the last resort, show up at the home, make it a big deal. Some of these cases we're learning about because the targets like Powell and lawmakers are sharing the information. With your experience of the judiciary, at what point do judges who are not supposed to read the temperature, that's what they tell us, can't look at one of these cases in isolation and be totally blind like Lady Justice when you got 15, 20 people being harassed by the government and they all have one thing in common, and it's not what their skin color and it's not their party, it's just whether they have independently exercised their rights in a way Trump doesn't like.
So there's good news, although I'm just going to briefly at the end just talk about when it comes to a search of a journalist, the limited authority that a court has. But what you're talking about is something that we've seen the courts push back. There were pending motions by Letitia James and James Comey for vindictive and selective prosecutions. Those never needed to be decided because the cases were dismissed on other grounds. But if those cases were to come back, those motions will be made again. But we have seen places where the court has reached that issue. Mr. Abrego Garcia, the individual who was illegally extracted from this country and sent to El Salvador, where he sort of rotted in a prison there, his judge in the criminal case has said that he is entitled to discovery on his claim for selective and vindictive prosecution. There's going to be a hearing on that at the end of January. In addition, Just Security, the legal forum, has recounted scores of judges who no longer are giving the government the presumption of regularity because they have seen the government make statements that are simply not true. They have questioned whether their orders have been followed, and they've just recounted over and over again things that were unheard of in Republican and Democratic administrations. And I just want to be clear, I've served in Republican and Democratic administrations. It is unheard of that as a government lawyer, you would disobey and as well as not be completely candid with the court about what you knew. But when it comes to the journalists, let me just quickly say, there's limited authority for what the courts can do there. This really is a question of Department of Justice policy. It is true that Pam Bondi sort of loosened the reins a bit from Merrick Garland and Eric Holder, but even she has said that this is supposed to be a last resort, and it's not clear how this is a last resort given the Washington Post reporting as to what was not done beforehand.